The book hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Maude Hadley stood in the middle of the dusty general store in Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, the year 1883, and she stared at the small folded paper that had fluttered out of the old leather-bound volume like a confession too long held in. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, not from the dry October wind that was rattling the store's single warped window, but from something far more dangerous than weather. She recognized the handwriting. It was her mother's handwriting. She had watched her mother's hands write those particular loops and slants 1,000 times before the fever took her, back in St. Louis 4 years ago when Maude was 22 and the world had still felt like a place with rules she understood. She had carried almost nothing west with her when she came to Harlan Creek at the invitation of her late uncle's estate lawyers. A carpet bag, 2 dresses, a photograph. But she had not carried this book, and she had certainly not put that folded paper inside it. "You want to tell me what that is?" The voice came from behind her, low and measured, and carrying the particular quality of a man who had learned that speaking too loudly in certain moments could shatter the wrong things. She turned slowly, still holding the paper, and found Abel Shelby watching her from the doorway of the back room, where he had been restocking shelves with tins of condensed milk. He was tall, lean in the way that hard work and scarce meals make a man lean rather than the way hunger makes him gaunt, and his dark eyes held that careful expression she had seen on him before, the expression that meant he was reading a situation the way a scout reads terrain before committing to a crossing. He had found the book. She knew that now, the truth of it landing on her chest like a stone. He had found the book among the estate items she had left at the store for sorting, and he had looked inside it, and he had seen something there that he was not admitting to yet. The betrayal of it stung sharp and fast before she could think the thought all the way through. "You looked through my things," she said. "I was cataloging the estate inventory. That book was in the crate without a name on it. Everything in that crate belonged to my uncle. I know that now. And you read it." A pause. The kind of pause that confirmed everything she feared. Abel Shelby, who ran Harlan Creek's general store and post office, and who served as the unofficial record-keeper of half the territory's business, had read something inside that book that had changed the nature of whatever small fragile arrangement had been growing between them for the past 6 weeks. She could see it in the way he was looking at her now, with a gravity that had not been there before, with something that looked dangerously close to pity, and she hated that more than she could say. "The recipe," he said. "The one your mother wrote." Maude looked down at the folded paper in her hand. She unfolded it carefully, as carefully as if it were made of something that could catch fire, and she read the words she had not yet let herself read, words in her mother's handwriting on paper that had been tucked deliberately, not accidentally, not carelessly, into the back pages of a book that had somehow traveled from a St. Louis parlor to a New Mexico Territory general store. It was a recipe for molasses cake. But below the ingredients and the instructions, in smaller letters that were pressed harder into the paper as if the writer had needed the extra pressure to make them real, were 4 sentences that changed everything Maude thought she had understood about her own life, about her mother's life, about why she had been sent west at all. She read those 4 sentences 3 times. Then she looked up at Abel Shelby and said, "How long have you known?" And that was where everything truly began. 6 weeks earlier, Maude Hadley had arrived in Harlan Creek on the afternoon stage from Santa Fe, wearing her second-best dress because her best one had a torn hem she had not had time or money to repair, carrying her carpetbag and the photograph, and the letter from the law firm of Denton and Greaves that said she was the sole heir to her Uncle Raymond Hadley's estate. She had never met her Uncle Raymond. Her mother had spoken of him rarely and always with a complicated expression that Maude had interpreted, in the careless way of a young woman who has not yet learned to pay attention to what people don't say, as some old family disagreement not worth understanding. Raymond Hadley had died in August cholera and had left behind a small house on the eastern edge of town, a mule named Brutus, and apparently a quantity of household goods that needed sorting before the estate could be properly settled. Harlan Creek was smaller than she had imagined. Main Street was 2 blocks of sun-bleached wooden storefronts, a livery, a church that also served as the schoolhouse on weekdays, a saloon called the Dusty Ace, and at the corner of Main and Creek Road, the general store with the words SHELBY Mercantile painted in red letters that had faded to a color somewhere between rust and regret. She had gone there first because the stage driver told her it was also where the town's post office operated, and she needed to send a wire to Denton and Greaves confirming her arrival. Abel Shelby had been standing behind the counter, writing something in a ledger when she pushed through the door. He was 30 years old, though she did not know that yet. She knew nothing about him except that he looked up from his ledger with a directness that most men did not practice, the kind of directness that is not rudeness, but rather the quality of a person who does not see the value in pretending not to notice what is directly in front of him. "Help you," he said. "I need to send a wire." "I was told this is also the post office." "It is." He set down his pen and came around the counter, moving with the economy of motion that she would later learn characterized everything he did. "Shelby's the name. Abel Shelby. You're the Hadley heir. News travels fast. In a town this size, news travels before the person does. I'm sorry about your uncle." She thanked him with the practiced brevity of someone who has received condolences for people she had not known and found the process somewhat hollow. He helped her compose the wire without asking unnecessary questions, which she appreciated. He told her the stage driver could take her trunk of sorted goods to the house when it came back through, which was practical. He offered her a cup of coffee from the pot he kept on the small stove in the corner, which she accepted because she was tired and the October air had been cold and the coffee was surprisingly good. She had not planned to stay in Harlan Creek any longer than it took to settle the estate. 6 weeks, the lawyers estimated. Perhaps 8. She had a position waiting for her back in St. Louis, a role as a seamstress's assistant that was not glamorous but was stable and known, and she was a woman who valued the stability of known things. She had not intended for Harlan Creek to become anything other than a temporary inconvenience on the way back to her real life, but the house turned out to need more work than the lawyers had indicated. And then there was the question of the mule Brutus, who had formed an attachment to a neighbor's mare and could not easily be separated for sale. And then it rained for a full week in a manner that the locals treated as remarkable, and that stranded her in a town with one hotel room that smelled of pipe tobacco and bad luck, and she found herself spending more time than strictly necessary at Shelby Mercantile, because it was warm and the coffee was good, and the man behind the counter was, without apparent effort or design, the most interesting person she had encountered in several years. She learned things about Abel Shelby, the way you learn things about a landscape you are crossing slowly on foot, detail by detail, each piece fitting into the one before it. He had grown up in Texas, in a small ranching community outside San Antonio, the second son of a man who had come from Tennessee with strong opinions and moderate means. He had come to New Mexico territory 6 years ago to take over the store from its previous owner, a man named Harkins who had wanted to retire, and had sold the business for a price that Abel had spent 4 years paying off. He read more than most men she had known, kept a small shelf of books behind the counter, and had opinions about them that he offered carefully and only when directly asked, but which, once offered, turned out to be worth hearing. He did not ask her personal questions. This was the thing she noticed most sharply. In a small town where her existence was a subject of considerable interest, and where every interaction at the hotel or the church on Sunday involved someone angling towards some piece of her history, Abel Shelby served her coffee and talked about books and answered her questions about the territory, and never once pressed her for the kind of intimate biographical information that people in small places so often feel entitled to. It was so unusual that it took her 2 weeks to understand it was deliberate, and another week after that to understand it as a form of respect. She started helping him in the store. This happened gradually, the way things that are not quite decisions happen. She was there one afternoon when a delivery arrived, and he was alone and overwhelmed, and she helped him sort and stack without being asked. And when it was done, he said thank you with a sincerity that was not excessive, and the next time she came in she did it again. And after about a week of this, they had arrived at an arrangement that neither of them had formally articulated but that suited them both. She was not paid, which she mentioned to him once with the directness she had inherited from somewhere. "I'm not employing you," he said. "You're choosing to help, that's different." "How so?" He thought about it for a moment, the way he thought about things that deserved actual thought rather than the fast, reflexive response. "Because an employee does what she's told. You do what you decide to do. I wouldn't presume to tell you what to do in my store or anywhere else." She looked at him over a can of peaches she was placing on a shelf. "Most men don't think that way." "Most men haven't read enough books," he said, and went back to his ledger, and she stood there for a moment with the can of peaches in her hand and something unfamiliar warming the inside of her chest. The sorting of her Uncle Raymond's estate had been proceeding in stages. The lawyers had sent a formal inventory list, but the actual items in the house did not perfectly match the list, as frequently happens when the person who has died was an old man living alone with his own organizational system. There were things in the house that no one had accounted for, and some of these things, including a wooden crate of books, had ended up at the store for Maude and able to sort together during the slow afternoon hours. It was in this crate that Abel had found the old book. It was a worn copy of a collection of household essays and domestic guidance, the kind of book that had been popular in the 1860s, with a cracked spine and pages that had been turned so many times they had grown soft at the corners. He had been flipping through it to determine whether it had any value as a saleable item or whether it should be offered to the church for the lending collection, and the folded piece of paper had fallen out of the back pages. He had not meant to read it. That was what he told her later, when the full story was laid out between them, and she believed him because she had come to know him well enough to know the difference between the things he said that were true and the things that people say when they want something to be true. The handwriting had caught his eye, the particular neatness of it, before he registered what it contained. He had read 2 sentences before he understood he was reading something private. Then he had read the remaining 2, because they concerned someone whose safety he had reason to care about. But she did not know any of that yet when she stood in the store on that October afternoon with the folded paper in her hand and asked him how long he had known, and the answer he gave her was not the one she expected. "I found it yesterday," he said. "I didn't read the whole thing. I read enough to know it wasn't mine to read, and then I put it back in the book and waited for you to come in so I could give it to you. The book falling on the floor wasn't planned." She looked at him. He met her gaze steadily, not defensively, not with the overeager sincerity of someone trying to sell her something, but with the plain patience of someone waiting for her to decide whether to believe him. She looked back at the paper. Her mother had written below the recipe, "Raymond has the full account of what happened to your father. I could not bring myself to ask him for it, and I am sorry for that cowardice. If you ever find yourself near him, please do not carry my silence as your own. The money your father left was hidden because it was safer hidden. Raymond knew where. I did not." Maude read those sentences again in the silence of the store, with the October wind outside and Abel Shelby watching her with careful attention, and the entire architecture of the life she had built on what she understood to be true cracked along seams she had not known were there. Her father, Thomas Hadley, had died when she was 7 years old. Or rather, she had been told he had died when she was 7 years old. The story her mother had given her was simple and sad. He had gone to prospect in the Colorado mountains, which men were doing in large numbers in 1868, and he had not come back, and eventually her mother had accepted that he was gone. Maude had accepted this story the way children accept painful stories, completely and without the capacity to examine it until much later, and by the time she was old enough to ask better questions, her mother had died of the fever and there was no one left to ask. But her mother had known more than she had told. Her mother had known that Raymond had something, knew something, held something that Maude was meant to find. And the recipe for molasses cake, pressed into the back of a domestic essay collection, in the hands of an uncle who had died in August before Maude ever arrived to ask him anything, was the message that had been waiting for her, a message she had almost missed, a message that had been preserved from accident by the simple fact that Abel Shelby had not thrown the book away. She sank into the wooden chair beside the counter, the one she had come to think of as hers in the informal, comfortable way that certain chairs in certain places become yours over the course of weeks without ceremony. Abel put a cup of coffee on the counter within her reach and said nothing, and the fact that he said nothing was the most generous thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. She sat with the paper for several minutes. Then she said, "My mother is telling me my father may not have died." "That's one reading," Abel said carefully. "Is there another?" He came around the counter and sat on the stool across from her, which was something he did not often do during store hours, and the deliberateness of it told her he was taking this seriously. It could mean he died leaving money and Raymond knew where it was put aside. It might not be about whether he was alive. She said he left it, past tense, but then she says Raymond knew where. If he simply died and left money, why would it be hidden? Men who die in the mountains don't usually have the time to hide money. No, Abel said, usually they don't. The store was quiet around them. It was mid-afternoon on a Tuesday in Harlan Creek, moved slowly on midweek afternoons. The cattle ranchers who made up most of the territory's population busy with their own concerns. The town going about its business at the unhurried pace that had made Maude simultaneously restless and grateful during her weeks here. She had been restless because she was a woman accustomed to the structured activity of city life. She had been grateful because the pace gave her space to think, and she was a person who needed space to think. Raymond lived here for 20 years, she said. He came here from St. Louis in the early 60s. He would have known my father before that. I can ask around, Abel said. Old Comte de Vereux has been in this territory since the 50s. He knew most of the men who came through in that era. He's got a memory like a ledger. She looked at him. You would do that. I already intended to, once I gave you the paper. He said it with a simplicity that made it more affecting than any elaborate gesture would have been. It seemed like the kind of thing a person needed to know. She was very aware, suddenly, of how close he was sitting, of the quality of stillness he had that was not passivity, but rather the stillness of someone who had decided that the current moment was exactly where they should be. She was aware of the way the afternoon light came through the dusty window and lay across his hands where they rested on the counter, the left one with a small scar on the knuckle from some past incident he had mentioned once without drama, the right one loose and easy in the way of hands that have learned to be patient. She looked away before he could see that she was looking. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with a weight that the words could barely carry. Abel went to see Comte de Vereux the next morning, a Thursday, before the store opened. Comte was 81 years old and had arrived in New Mexico Territory in 1851, as a young man with a wagon and impractical ambitions, had survived long enough to see those ambitions replace themselves with something more durable, namely a small adobe house, a garden, and the satisfaction of knowing more about the territory's human history than anyone else alive within 100 miles. He sat on his porch in a rocking chair that had seen better decades and listened to Abel with his eyes half closed in the way of very old men who are paying more attention than they appear to. "Thomas Hadley," Comte repeated when Abel had finished. "From St. Louis. Come west around 1867, 1868. Fit the timeline." Comte rocked. A roadrunner appeared at the edge of the porch, regarded them with its characteristic skeptical intelligence, and departed. "I knew a Thomas Hadley. Wasn't a prospector, though. or wasn't just a prospector. He was moving money for a land syndicate, which was the polite way people described what those operations did in those years. Buying up territory land claims before the railroad routes were announced, then selling at considerable profit once the routes became public. Abel kept his expression neutral. Was that legal? Depends very much on which year you're asking about and which judge you're asking in front of. Combs smiled with the comfortable relativism of someone who had watched a great deal of law get applied selectively. Hadley fell out with the syndicate. They had a disagreement about the distribution of proceeds from one particular acquisition. He disappeared not long after, and the story went around that he'd gone back east. I don't know what really happened to him. Could he have survived? Combs looked at him for a long moment. The syndicate had a man they used for disagreements that couldn't be resolved in a ledger. A man named Crane. Gus Crane. If Hadley ran fast enough and far enough, it's possible he got out. He paused. But Crane was thorough. Abel rode back to Harlan Creek with this information settling into him like a cold weight. And the weight had a specific character that he recognized as the feeling of something important becoming more complicated than it initially appeared. He had known, in the abstract way that a man knows things he has not fully examined, that his feelings for Maude Hadley were becoming something significant. He had permitted himself this awareness without acting on it because she was a woman in a temporary situation who had a life waiting for her in another city, and he was not the kind of man who made claims on women who had not invited them. But this information changed the nature of her temporary situation, and something in him that he was trying to keep disciplined was pushing quietly but persistently against the discipline. He found her at the store when he returned, which had become so normal over the past weeks that it required actual conscious noting for him to register it as remarkable. She was behind the counter, having served herself the coffee and apparently helped a customer while he was gone, because there was coin on the counter and a gap on the shelf where a tin of baking powder had been. "Well," she said. He told her what Combs had told him. He told her carefully, without editorializing where editorializing would have served his own sense of what she ought to feel, and without softening the parts that were hard. She listened. She was very still in the way she was still when something was moving fast inside her while she maintained control of the surface. He had learned to read this particular stillness, had come to find it one of her more remarkable qualities, the capacity for interior intensity paired with exterior composure. When he finished, she said, "So my father may have been involved in something dishonest, and he may have had enemies as a result, and my uncle may have known something about what happened to him and kept the money somewhere safe. That's a fair summary. And if there's a man named Gus Crane in this story, then the money, if it exists, is money that someone else believes belongs to them. Also a fair summary." She was quiet for a moment. "Does anyone know where this Crane is now?" Abel did not want to answer this particular question. Combs thinks he moved his operations north toward Colorado in the 1870s. There were better opportunities there once the mining boom started. But he doesn't know for certain. Maude looked at the folded recipe, which she had put on the counter when she came in and which had been sitting there between them like a small declaration. "Then I need to find out what Raymond knew, what he might have written down, left somewhere, told someone. Maude." He said her name carefully, with the deliberateness he applied to things that mattered. "If your father ran from people who wanted to harm him over money, then looking for that money is not something to do carelessly. I'm not a careless person. I know you're not." He met her eyes. "But you're also someone who just learned that the story of her own life might be substantially different from the story she was told, and that's the kind of discovery that can make careful people make uncharacteristic decisions." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. This was something she did, he had noticed, this deliberate counting of moments when she was deciding something. "Are you telling me not to look?" "No. I'm telling you not to look alone." The silence between them after that sentence had a specific quality, the quality of something that had been in the room without acknowledgement now acknowledged, a thing that once noticed could not be unnoticed. "All right," she said. And then, because she was Maude Hadley and not a woman who left important things implicit when they could be explicit. "Thank you, again." "Stop thanking me," he said. "It's becoming excessive." She almost smiled. It was the particular almost smile that pulled one corner of her mouth before the full expression could form, the one that he had been cataloging since the second week with the precision of a man who is not ready to admit to himself what he is cataloging and why. Raymond Hadley's house was a modest adobe structure at the eastern edge of town, low-ceilinged and cool in summer and cold in November, which it was rapidly becoming. Maude had been sleeping there rather than the hotel since the second week, partly because it was free and partly because it felt like the right thing to do, to occupy the space her uncle had occupied, to let herself understand something about him by living briefly in the shape of his life. She had already searched the house once, in the preliminary way she had searched it at the beginning, looking for what a lawyer's inventory might have missed. Now she searched it again with Abel's help, and with the specific purpose of looking for the hidden thing her mother had written about. Abel was methodical in a way that complemented her thoroughness. She worked from the outside in, examining every surface, every wall, every floor. He worked from the inside out, looking at the furniture and what might be inside or beneath it. They worked in companionable quiet broken by occasional observations, a silence that had developed its own grammar over weeks of working alongside each other in the store. It was Abel who found the loose board in the bedroom floor. It was not immediately obvious. The board had been carefully replaced, the edges tamped down with something that held them firm, unless you pressed on the plank at precisely the right angle with precisely the right pressure, which Abel discovered by accident when he moved the small iron bedstead to look beneath it. Beneath the board was a tin box. Inside the tin box was a leather pouch, and inside the leather pouch was $340 in bills, a folded document that appeared to be a bill of sale for a land claim in southern Colorado dated 1869, a letter written in a hand that was not Raymond's and not Maude's mother's, and a smaller envelope addressed to Maude Hadley in her uncle's handwriting, which was notable because he had died in August and she had not arrived until October. He had written the envelope before he knew when she would come. He had known she would eventually come. Maude sat on the edge of the bare bedstead with the small envelope in her hands, and Abel stood near the window with his arms at his sides, not looking at her, giving her the privacy of his peripheral presence, which was the specific form of consideration she had come to rely on without ever having asked for it. She opened the envelope. Raymond Hadley's letter was 3 pages in the close handwriting of an old man who is aware he is saying something important and wants to be precise. He explained, in the way of someone who has carried a secret long enough to need to unburden it properly, that Thomas Hadley had not died in the Colorado mountains. He had run. He had taken his portion of the syndicate money, the portion he argued was legitimately his for the claims he had personally identified, and he had disappeared, and Raymond had helped him disappear. He had gone to Mexico, a small settlement in Sonora. Raymond had received 2 letters from him, the last in 1874, when Thomas Hadley had written that he was in good health and working as a surveyor for a Mexican land company, and did not expect to return to the United States because returning would mean confronting what he had left behind, which was everything, including his wife and his daughter. Raymond wrote, "I am not defending what your father did. I am only giving you the full accounting that your mother was too pained to give. The money in this box is what he sent through me over the years for your keeping, in case you ever needed it. Your mother would not take it because she was proud and because taking it meant acknowledging he was alive, which she could not bear. I kept it for you. It was always meant for you." And then in the final paragraph, "If you are reading this, I am gone, and I am sorry I was not here to tell you face to face. You deserved better than a letter under a floor. But we Hadleys have a tradition of communicating through concealment, which your mother continued with her recipe book, and so perhaps it is fitting." Maude sat with the letter for a long time. Abel remained near the window, not pressing, not asking, being present in the exact way she needed someone to be present, with the particular grace of a person who understands that some moments require witness more than they require action. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright but not overflowing, because she was that kind of woman, the kind who feels things at full depth and expresses them with precision rather than volume. "He's alive," she said. "Or was as of 9 years ago. That's something," Abel said. "I don't know what to do with it. You don't have to know today." She looked at the money and the documents and the letter spread across her knee. $340 is a great deal of money. It's yours. Legitimately or not, it was sent for you. "The land claim," she said, looking at the bill of sale. "Southern Colorado. Do you know anything about Colorado land claims from 1869? Not specifically, but there are ways to find out." She looked at him across the small spare room, through the afternoon light that came through the one window in the west wall, and that lay across the floor in a long rectangle the color of old bronze. He was watching her with that steady attention that she had stopped trying to pretend did not affect her. "Abel," she said, "why are you doing this?" He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Because it matters to you. You barely know me." "I know you well enough," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of qualification or embellishment, was more persuasive than any elaborate declaration would have been. "I know what books you choose when you look at the shelf. I know how you take your coffee. I know you count to 3 when you're making a decision, and you tap your finger on whatever surface is nearest when you're thinking hard. I know you're fair and you're careful and you don't complain about things that deserve complaining about, which is a form of dignity that is less common than it should be." He paused. "That's not knowing everything about a person, but it's not nothing." Maude Hadley, who had been managing her own affairs for 4 years, and who had become very competent at the management of her own feelings along with everything else, found herself in the unusual position of not having a ready response. "The tap," she said finally. "I didn't know I did that. You do it constantly. That's embarrassing." "It's charming," he said, and then appeared to consider whether he had said too much and decided he hadn't, because he didn't take it back. She looked at the letter again, at her uncle's cramped, careful handwriting, at the news of a father who was alive somewhere in Mexico and who had chosen to stay there rather than come back. She felt a great deal about that, feelings that were complex and partially contradictory, anger and something not quite grief, and something that might eventually become understanding, all of them requiring more time and more privacy than she currently had. But underneath all of that, separate from all of that, was the awareness of the man standing near the window in the late afternoon light, and the awareness had a warmth to it that was entirely independent of the November cold and entirely dependent on things she was not yet ready to say aloud. She stood up and folded the letter carefully and put it in the envelope and put the envelope in the tin box with the rest of it. "I would like to write to the address in Mexico," she said. "The one my uncle had. I don't expect a response, but I want to have tried. I'll help you compose it if you want. I think I need to write it myself, but I would like you to read it before I send it." This distinction, she saw, meant something to him. The way his expression shifted slightly, the way the careful guard he kept over his own reactions moved just enough to show what was beneath it, was something she stored in the part of herself where she kept the things that mattered. "All right," he said. She went back to the store with him. It was November now, definitively and without the residual warmth that October had sometimes offered. And Harlan Creek in November had a particular character. The ranches pulling in, the cattle settled, the community's social gravity concentrating itself around the church and the store and the saloon, the way small places concentrate themselves in winter. Maude had been told she was welcome to stay on at the Harlan Creek Ladies' Aid meeting, which convened on Friday evenings at the church. And she had been going because it was the right thing to do, and because the women there, who were in their practical experience far more interesting than the novelistic version of frontier wives that she had encountered in popular literature, had begun to feel like actual companions. She told no one about the recipe or the letter or what she had found under the floor. Some things required more processing before they could become conversation. But the following Sunday, after the church service that was held in the schoolhouse with Reverend Holt presiding over a congregation that ranged from devout to merely cold and looking for company, she found herself walking back up Main Street alongside Abel in the natural way that had developed over weeks, and she told him something she had been thinking about. "I don't want to go back to St. Louis," she said. He did not show surprise. "Is that a new discovery or one you're just putting into words?" "Both, I think." They walked for a moment in the sound of boot heels on packed earth, the town quiet around them in the Sunday morning way. "The seamstress position," he said. "I was never very good at it. I was competent, which is not the same thing. I did it because it was available and I needed to be available for my mother in her last years, and then she was gone and it was what I already knew, so I kept doing it." "What are you good at?" She thought about it. "Organizing things, keeping track of things, understanding what is needed before it is asked for, looking at a chaotic situation and seeing the order that should be inside it." He was quiet for a step, 2 steps. 3, those are the precise qualities that would make someone excellent at running a store. She stopped walking. He stopped a half step later and turned to look at her, and she could see in his face that he had said the thing that was true and had said it before he had finished deciding whether to say it, and now he was waiting to see what she did with it. "Abel Shelby," she said, "are you offering me a position?" "I'm observing a practical convergence," he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing words very precisely because the wrong words in this particular moment would be a significant error. "You have skills that my store needs. You appear to have reconsidered your timeline. Those 2 facts converge in an obvious direction. And the fact that you would prefer I not leave. Is that also a fact?" A very long pause. The Sunday morning air around them was cold and still and smelled of wood smoke from the houses along the street. A dog ambled across the road without urgency. Somewhere down near the livery a horse made a sound of mild discontent. "Yes," he said, "that is also a fact." Maude Hadley stood on the main street of Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, in November of 1883, and looked at Abel Shelby, and understood that this was the moment when everything that had been building between them over 6 weeks of coffee and books and quiet working hours and careful attention arrived at its proper shape. "I would like to have a proper conversation about this," she said, "not in the middle of the street." "Name the time," he said. "Sunday dinner, my uncle's house, I'll cook." She paused. "Though I should warn you, I'm using my mother's recipe for molasses cake." Something happened in his expression then, a shifting of the guard, a warmth coming through that was not calculated and not restrained, a genuine human response to the particular beauty of what she had just said, which was not about the cake at all, and they both knew it. "I'll bring the coffee," he said. She wrote the letter to Mexico that week. She wrote it alone, at her uncle's table, in the lamplit evenings after the temperature had dropped, and the fire in the small stove was doing everything it could. And she wrote it as honestly as she could, which was the only way she knew how to write anything important. She told her father, if he was still alive and still at the address her uncle had kept, that she had found his letters and the tin box and understood the situation as fully as she was able to without his account. She told him she was not writing to demand his return or to condemn his choices, because she did not yet know how she felt about his choices, and she thought it dishonest to claim she did. She told him she was his daughter and she was well and she was in Harlan Creek where her uncle had lived, and she would be here for some time and she would appreciate knowing whether he was still alive and if so, something of his life. She gave it to Abel to read. He read it at the counter with his coffee while she stood across from him and tried to look occupied with the shelf inventory. He looked up when he was done and said, "It's the right letter." "You think so?" "It says exactly what should be said without requiring him to be anything other than what he is. That's hard to do with people who have hurt you. I'm not certain I feel hurt yet. I think the hurt is queued up somewhere behind the information." That's how these things usually work. She sent it that Tuesday with the departing mail. Sunday dinner at Raymond Hadley's adobe house was the beginning of something that both of them understood was beginning, which made it both more deliberate and more full of meaning than the informal accumulation of their previous 6 weeks. Maude cooked the molasses cake from the recipe in her mother's handwriting, following the instructions exactly as written because they were her mother's instructions, and it seemed important to follow them exactly. And she also made a beef stew with the vegetables available in November in a small New Mexico town, which were limited but adequate. Abel arrived promptly, which she had expected. He brought the coffee and also a bottle of rye whiskey that he said was for after, if the occasion warranted it. He also brought a book, which he set on the table with the straightforwardness of someone who has thought about a gesture and decided it was the right one. It was a novel, a recent one she had mentioned wanting to read, and she looked at it for a moment and then looked at him and said nothing, which was the correct response to something that required no comment. They ate. They talked for 4 hours without any of the halting awkward pauses that conversation between two people who are negotiating new emotional territory usually involves. Because they had been having easy conversation for 6 weeks, and the new emotional territory they were negotiating was not a departure from what they already had but a continuation of it at a greater depth. They talked about the territory, about what it was like to be a man from Texas trying to make something in a place where the rules were still being worked out. They talked about St. Louis and what she missed and what she did not miss. They talked about her Uncle Raymond, whom she was developing a retrospective affection for, a man who had kept money and secrets for two people who needed both kept. They talked about books. They talked about what it meant to stay somewhere versus what it meant to pass through, and whether those were always different or sometimes the same. The whiskey came out after the cake, and it was, as Abel had predicted, warranted. "I want to tell you something," Maude said, when the evening had reached the late comfortable stage and the fire in the stove was burning low and steady, and the lamp on the table made a warm enclosed circle of light around them. "All right," he said. "I came here expecting to settle an estate and leave. I had no intention of any of this." She gestured slightly, meaning the house and the town and the evening and him all at once. "I know. And I find that the absence of the intention makes it feel more true, not less." He looked at her across the table. "I've been thinking about how to say something to you for about 3 weeks," he said. "I keep revising it because I keep finding the previous version insufficient." "What is it?" "That I would like this to continue, that I would like you to stay, not only in the practical sense of the store, but in the sense that I would like you to be here. And I understand that's a great deal to ask of someone who has a life elsewhere, and I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to know that's what I want." Maude Hadley, who had learned from a recipe card in her dead mother's handwriting that lives are built on what we leave behind for the right person to find, set her glass on the table very carefully and said, "I would like you to stop waiting for the right version and simply say things, Abel. The imperfect version is sufficient. I am not a woman who requires perfect sentences." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that had shed the careful, measured quality and was speaking from somewhere more directly available, "I don't want you to leave." "Then I won't," she said. The winter in Harlan Creek settled in with the specific determined quality of New Mexico Territory winters, cold at night and bright, and searingly clear in the daytime, the sun brilliant on brown earth and the shadows long and sharp. Maude moved properly and formally into the role at Shelby Mercantile, with a salary this time, because the arrangement needed to be proper and Abel insisted on it. And the town, which had been watching their developing situation with the interested attention of a small community, received this news with a range of responses from enthusiastic approval to mild scandal, to the kind of careful wait-and-see neutrality that characterized the more judicious residents. She stayed in her uncle's house. This also was proper, and she did not question the propriety because she understood its value in this context. She was a woman alone in a small town, and the town's opinion of her was something she needed, and she maintained it with the combination of warmth and dignity that had always served her. But Abel came to dinner twice a week. This became the arrangement, as natural and as discussed as anything else they agreed upon. Tuesdays and Sundays. He brought things sometimes: a cut of beef when the ranchers came through with fresh supply, a book he had finished and thought she should read, once a small bouquet of dried flowers that a traveling vendor had brought through, and that he had bought because they were the color of something she'd been wearing the day before, which he did not say, and which she understood without his saying it. They talked and walked and read and worked. The conversation that had started from a handwritten recipe and a falling book grew and branched and deepened, reaching into corners of both their histories that neither of them had shared with other people, the particular intimacy of two people who have recognized in each other someone worth being honest with. He told her about his family in Texas, about his father who had firm ideas about what a man's life should look like, and had not included owning a store in New Mexico territory on the approved list, and about the departure from that home being both necessary and painful. He told her about a woman in San Antonio, years ago, who he had expected to marry and who had married someone else instead, and the way he had spent 2 years being angry about it before he understood that the anger was mostly about the damage to his certainty rather than the actual loss of her. She told him about her mother's long illness and the way it had restructured her entire young adulthood around caregiving, and how she had not resented this, but had arrived at the end of it feeling like she had been quietly misplaced from her own story without quite noticing it happening. She told him about the St. Louis seamstress's shop and the women who worked there, their individual complicated lives, which she had observed with the attention of someone who has learned to be interested in other people as a survival strategy. She told him about the day she had received the lawyer's letter about her uncle's estate, and how she had felt not grief exactly, but something more like curiosity, the first genuine curiosity she had felt about her own future in longer than she could measure. "Do you think that's what brought you here?" he asked one Tuesday evening in January. "The curiosity. I think the recipe brought me here," she said, "in every sense." He smiled at that, the full version of the smile, not the careful almost version he used in public situations, but the one that changed his face entirely in the way that complete expressions always do. It was February when the letter came from Mexico. Maude was behind the counter when Abel brought it from the mail pouch, and she saw the foreign postmark before she saw anything else, and her hands went still on the counter for a moment before she picked it up. Thomas Hadley was alive. He was 61 years old and in good health, and living in a small town in Sonora called Magdalena, where he worked as a land surveyor, and had done so for 15 years. He had a life there, modest and quiet, and, he wrote, not unhappy, though he acknowledged the word happiness was complicated when one had done what he had done. He wrote that he had thought about Maude every year since he left. He had not come back because coming back meant accounting for himself in ways he was not certain he deserved to survive. He wrote that Raymond's death had shaken him deeply, that Raymond had been his last connection to the life before, and that receiving Maude's letter had been the most significant thing that had happened to him in many years. He wrote, "I will not ask you to forgive me, because I know I do not have the right to ask you for anything. But if you ever wanted to know more about what happened, I would tell you everything that I have never told anyone. I owe you that accounting." Maude read the letter 3 times at the counter. The store was otherwise empty. Abel stood near the stove, not reading it over her shoulder, waiting. When she looked up, he crossed to the counter in the direct way he moved when something mattered. "He's alive," she said. "I gathered." He paused. "How do you feel?" "I don't know yet." She folded the letter. "I know that I want to write back. I know that I want to go on writing until I know how I feel. I don't think I need to make a decision about what he is to me immediately." "No," Abel agreed. Some things are built correspondence by correspondence. She looked at him with the particular sharpness of recognition that his better observations sometimes produced in her. "Like other things," she said. "Like other things," he agreed. She wrote back. Thomas Hadley wrote again. The correspondence established itself over the following months with a regularity that was both strange and natural. Strange because she was writing to a stranger who was her father. Natural because the exchange of letters was something she had always been good at. He was a thoughtful writer, her father, with the careful precision of someone who had spent years surveying land and had learned the value of accurate measurement. He described things carefully. He answered questions directly. She learned his story piece by piece, and the story was complicated in the way that stories involving moral failure always are. Not simply villainous, not simply innocent, but human. A man who had done something wrong and had been afraid and had kept running even after the running was no longer strictly necessary, because stopping meant confronting what the running had cost. She did not excuse him. But she came, over months of letters, to understand him, which was a different thing. Spring arrived in Harlan Creek with the particular extravagance of desert springs, when the land that has been brown and rigid for months suddenly produces color in a quantity that seems excessive and wonderful. Maude had been in Harlan Creek for 7 months, and she understood now that she had not been passing through, but had been arriving, slowly. The way some arrivals happen so gradually that you only recognize them in retrospect. She also understood, with the clarity that arrives when you stop deliberately managing your own perceptions and simply allow yourself to know what you know, that she was in love with Abel Shelby. This was not a surprise exactly. She had been watching the approach of this knowledge for months with the slightly resigned awareness of someone watching weather come in from a long distance, knowing it will arrive and preparing appropriately. But the knowledge itself, when it settled into her fully, had a quality she had not anticipated, which was relief. She had not expected love to feel like relief. She had expected it to feel more complicated than it did, more contested, because she was a person who complicated her own interior experiences as a matter of thoroughness. Instead, it felt like recognition, like arriving at a conclusion that had been building logically from the beginning. She told him on a Sunday in April. They had gone for a walk along the creek that gave the town its name, which in April was actually running rather than pretending to run, a narrow, cheerful strip of water between banks of cottonwood and mesquite. The afternoon was warm and entirely beautiful, with the particular New Mexico quality of beauty that is stark and enormous and does not require your approval to be what it is. She stopped walking near a stand of young cottonwoods and turned to face him directly, in the mode she used when she was being fully deliberate. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that plainly and without it being part of a longer sentence where I qualify it." Abel Shelby, who had grown up in a family where strong feelings were expressed through action rather than declaration, and who had spent 10 years being carefully self-possessed in a town where being anything else had seemed inadvisable, stood in the April sunlight beside the running creek and did something she had never seen him do before, which was that his eyes went bright for a moment with something that was not sadness, but was shaped like the relief she had felt herself when she had finally let herself know what she knew. "I love you," he said. And then, because he was able and even in significant moments he maintained some version of himself, without qualification. She laughed, and it was a laugh that she did not manage or modulate but simply let happen, full and unguarded. And he was smiling at her, the complete version, and the creek was running and the cottonwoods were new-leafed, and the sky was the particular blue that exists only in New Mexico in spring, which is a blue that makes the word blue seem insufficient. He kissed her there by the creek, in the straightforward way that he did everything that mattered, not tentatively but not urgently either, with the confidence of someone who is certain of what they're doing and why. She kissed him back with the confidence of someone who has arrived at a decision through rigorous examination and is prepared to commit to it entirely. The town, as she had predicted, had opinions. Harlan Creek's opinions on the developing romantic situation between Maude Hadley and Abel Shelby ranged across a familiar spectrum. Mrs. Alderton from the Ladies' Aid said it was the most sensible development she had witnessed in years, which was her form of enthusiastic approval. The Reverend expressed his customary hopefulness about the sanctifying value of matrimony whenever the subject arose. Old Combe de Veru, hearing about it from the usual channels, sent Abel a note that said only, "About time, boy," which Abel pinned to the back wall of the storeroom with a satisfaction he did not entirely conceal from Maude. The situation at the Dusty Ace Saloon produced a small number of opinions that did not flatter her, as small-town saloons sometimes do when a woman of perceived independence is involved. And Abel heard about these and addressed them with a brevity and directness that left no ambiguity about his position. And after that the opinions from that quarter moderated significantly. The question of what came next was one they discussed with the same practicality they brought to every other significant question. She was established at the store. He owned the store. The natural direction was clear, but she was not a woman who moved in natural directions without examining them first, and she told him so. "I want to stay in Harlan Creek," she said in June, when the heat was full and the days were long and they were sitting on the porch of the store in the late evening after closing, which had become a ritual of considerable comfort. "I have decided that. I want to be here." "Good," he said. "And I want to keep working, not as a kept woman, but as someone with a specific function and value." "You already do that." "Yes, but I want the arrangement to be formal. I want us to be formal." He turned to look at her in the evening light. "Is that a proposal, Maude?" She considered the word. "I suppose it is." "I was planning to do that," he said, with the mild affront of someone whose preparation has been preempted. "When? When I had the right version." She remembered saying this to him before, about waiting for the right version, and she looked at him with the affection that his consistency produced in her, which was considerable. "Abel, you have had the right version for several months. Ask the question." He took her hand, which he had been doing with an ease and naturalness that still occasionally startled her with how right it felt. He looked at her directly, as he always did when something mattered. "Maude Hadley," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without qualification. They were married in October of 1884, exactly 1 year after she had arrived on the afternoon stage from Santa Fe with a carpetbag and a photograph, and no idea what was waiting for her in Harlan Creek. The ceremony was held in the church schoolhouse, performed by Reverend Holt, attended by what appeared to be the entirety of Harlan Creek and its surrounding ranches, because in a town this size a wedding was an event of communal importance, and the community took its importance seriously. She wore her best dress, which she had finally repaired the hem on, and she carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Abel had ridden out early in the morning to find. He wore his best coat, which he had ordered from a catalog in August, and which fit him in a way that suggested the catalog had his measurements exactly right. And he stood at the altar with the stillness that was characteristic of him, and watched her walk up the aisle with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, and that she understood immediately. The expression of a person who has arrived somewhere they had not known they were traveling toward. Old Combe de Veru attended in his rocking chair, which 2 of the younger men carried into the church for him, and he appeared to sleep through most of the service, but applauded at the conclusion with more vigor than expected. The Ladies' Aid produced a reception of considerable ambition and remarkable execution. The molasses cake, made from the recipe in Maude's mother's handwriting, was served as one of the desserts, and Maude had told the story to Mrs. Alderton, who had told it to the others, and there was a general agreement at the Ladies' Aid table that this was one of the finest stories any of them had heard, which Maude found more embarrassing and more moving than she expected. She wrote to her father about the wedding. He wrote back with a warmth that had been building across their year of correspondence, a warmth that was the warmth of a man who is being allowed to love his daughter from a great distance after having believed he had forfeited the right. And in his letter he said he was glad and he was sorry he could not be there, and he hoped she was the happiest she had ever been. She replied that she was. The first year of their marriage had the quality she had expected it to have, which was the quality of two competent, self-sufficient people, discovering the specific pleasures and occasional irritations of genuine, sustained closeness. Abel was tidy in the store and somewhat less tidy at home, which she addressed with directness, and which he improved upon with genuine effort. She was inclined to work late into the evenings when the books were not balancing, and he was inclined to tell her to come to bed, and she was more often wrong about the importance of finishing tonight over beginning fresh tomorrow than she would have predicted. They disagreed about inventory strategy, specifically about how much of any single item to order in advance, which was an ongoing negotiation that never fully resolved but produced, through its continuation, a supply system that was better than either of their individual approaches would have been. They were well matched in the ways that matter most, which are the ways that cannot be assessed in advance. They were well matched in the quality of attention they gave to things that deserved attention, and in their respective fundamental decencies, and in the specific way they found each other interesting. She found him interesting in fresh ways regularly, which continued to surprise her. He apparently found her equally interesting, which she found somewhat more surprising, because she was conscious of herself in the specific way that very self-aware people are conscious of their own limitations. She told him this once, that she was not certain what sustained freshness she could offer given her nature. He looked at her over the book he was reading in the lamplight of the house that they had made their house, Raymond's adobe that they had filled with their combined things, and that felt entirely differently than it had felt when she first moved into it alone. "Maude," he said, "you explained to me last Tuesday why your method of stacking the dry goods would reduce my restocking time by an average of 6 minutes per day. You backed this up with 3 weeks of measured data. There is no version of the future in which I find you anything other than riveting." She threw a dishcloth at him, which was undignified and which he caught without looking up from his book, and she sat down across from him with her own book, and the lamp warm between them, and felt, very clearly and without the need for analysis, that this was the life she was supposed to have. Not the life she had expected or planned, but the one that had been waiting inside a falling book and a recipe card, and a conversation that had started on an October afternoon in 1883 and had simply never stopped. In the spring of 1886, their son was born. They named him Raymond Thomas Shelby, the two names for the two men who had been part of the story of how they arrived at each other. And Raymond Thomas was a substantial and opinionated child from his first hours, which Abel said was entirely her contribution, and which she said was impossible given that he had never once in 4 years failed to have a firmly held position on any subject whatsoever. The store adapted around the baby the way things in small towns adapt, collectively and without ceremony. Mrs. Alderton kept him on certain afternoons. Abel built a small wooden box-like seat that could be positioned safely behind the counter. Old Comte de Veru, who had lived to see the baby and who died the following summer with considerable completeness at the age of 84, visited twice and told the child with some seriousness that he had been named for a good man and a complicated one, which was the best possible description of either Raymond or Thomas Hadley, and which Maude appreciated for its precision. Thomas Hadley, Maude's father, came north from Mexico in the fall of 1887. He was 65 years old and had written to her the previous spring that his health was declining and that he believed, if she was willing, he would like to see her once before whatever remained of his time was spent. She and Abel discussed it thoroughly as they discussed everything. "You don't have to see him," Abel said. "I know. But you want to. I want to have tried, she said. I want to be the kind of person who tries. He came by stage, an old man with the sun-baked look of someone who had lived under bright southern skies for 25 years, with white hair and a careful way of moving that spoke of joints that were beginning to make themselves known. He was thinner than the man she had constructed from her imagination, and from his letters, and taller. And he had her mother's particular way of going still when he was uncertain, which she recognized from the inside because she did it herself. They met in the general store, which was fitting. Abel was there, slightly behind her, present without being obtuse, in the exact manner she had come to depend on him for. Thomas Hadley looked at his daughter across the counter of a store in a town he had never been to, in a life he had not anticipated, and he appeared to be struggling with something profound. "You look like your mother," he said, "which I expected, but you look like yourself more, which I am glad for." She studied him. The feelings were not simple. They were not going to become simple. She had accepted this in advance, which was the kind of preparation that did not make things easier but made them more possible. "I would like you to meet my husband," she said, "and your grandson." Raymond Thomas was brought out from the back room where he had been napping in the wooden box seat, 11 months old and already possessed of a personality that left no ambiguity about what kind of person he intended to be. He regarded Thomas Hadley with the frank, comprehensive assessment of a baby who has learned that faces contain information. Thomas Hadley looked at the baby, and something went through him that was visible even across the complicated geography of their relationship, a visible release of something held tightly for too long. "He looks like a Hadley," the old man said. "He looks like a Shelby," Abel said from behind Maude, with the mild certainty of a man entirely secure in his position. And then, after a pause that was warm rather than sharp, "Sit down, Mr. Hadley. I'll get you some coffee." Thomas Hadley stayed in Harlan Creek for 3 weeks. He and Maude talked every day. Some of the conversations were hard, the accounting he had promised her, the full story told without softening, and she listened without either demanding more than he had or accepting less than the truth. Some conversations were simply the ordinary conversation of two people who are trying to know each other, which is what they were. He was not the father she would have written for herself, but he was her father, and she was the daughter who had grown up in his absence and become entirely herself without him, and there was both loss and dignity in that, and she chose, finally, to acknowledge both. When he left to return to Mexico, he shook Abel's hand with the formal sincerity of a man who recognizes genuine worth in another. "You have a good one," he told her at the stage, nodding at Abel, who was standing with Raymond Thomas on his hip a few feet away. "I know," she said. "He died in Sonora the following spring, peacefully, in the town of Magdalena where he had made his reduced life." His death reached her by letter with a delay that was the cost of distance, and she received the news on a Tuesday morning behind the counter of Shelby Mercantile and was quiet about it for a while. And then she told Abel, and he closed the store for the afternoon, and they walked along the creek with Raymond Thomas toddling between them. And she talked about what she felt, which was complicated and real, and included grief for a man she had only partially known, which was a form of grief that she found she could carry without being diminished by it. Their second child came in 1889, a girl they named Clara, after no one specifically, but because the name suited her from the first moment. Clara was altogether different from Raymond Thomas, quiet where he was declarative, watchful where he was exploratory, possessed of her father's particular stillness and her mother's precision, which was a combination that promised a person of formidable patience and accuracy. The store grew through the late 1880s as Harlan Creek grew, slowly but steadily, as towns in the territory were growing, the railroad pushing further into New Mexico and the cattle industry expanding, and the settlement patterns of the West consolidating into something that was beginning to feel less temporary. Abel expanded the store in 1888, adding a section to the back, and hiring a young man from one of the nearby ranches, a boy named Luis Vega, whose family had been in the territory for 3 generations, and who turned out to be exceptionally good at everything required of him, and who was treated accordingly. Maude took on, in addition to her store responsibilities, a role as the town's unofficial librarian, which was not a formal position because there was no formal library, but which she created from the practical conviction that a town needed more books than the church shelf currently provided. She wrote to publishers in the East and negotiated a system of donated volumes. She organized a small lending collection in a back corner of the store that grew over 3 years into something that required its own shelving, and that drew people from the surrounding ranches with a regularity that delighted her. The recipe, her mother's recipe in her mother's handwriting, she had framed. This was Abel's idea, offered one evening with the casualness he used for ideas he was not entirely sure she would agree with. "It should be somewhere visible," he said. "It's the beginning of everything." She looked at him. "It's a recipe for molasses cake. It's a recipe for molasses cake in 4 sentences that change the direction of your life. And mine," he paused, "frame it." She framed it. It hung in the kitchen of the adobe house, between the window and the stove, in a plain wooden frame that Abel had made himself with more care than strictly necessary for a frame. And it hung there through everything that followed, through the years and the seasons and the children growing and the store expanding and the territory changing around them as territories do. In 1891, New Mexico Territory was still working toward statehood, which would not come for 2 more decades, but the changes that would eventually produce a state were already reshaping the land and its people. Harlan Creek was larger than it had been in 1883, not large but larger, with a proper school building separate from the church and a second general store that Abel regarded with the equanimity of a man who has decided that competition is a fact of commerce and not a personal affront. The Ladies' Aid had grown and now ran a proper annual fundraiser and had built a reading room adjacent to the church. The saloon had changed hands twice. Maude's life, which she had never planned to be a life in Harlan Creek, was more fully a life in Harlan Creek than any life she had previously lived anywhere was a life in that place. She was known here in the deep way that you are known in a small town when you have been there long enough, known not as a new thing or an interesting addition, but simply as part of the place, one of the people without whom the place would be somewhat different and somewhat less. She was 31 years old and had been married for 7 years and had 2 children and a business, and a correspondence with her surviving father's memory through the letters she kept, and a framed recipe on her kitchen wall, and a man across from her at every dinner table and in the store, and along the creek on Sunday afternoons who was the most interesting person she had ever met and who showed no signs of becoming less so. She said this to him once, how strange it was that he did not bore her. He looked up from his ledger with the expression that was his version of theatrical offense, which was very mild because theatrical offense required a performance quality he did not possess. "You expected to be bored," he said. "I thought it likely. I have been bored by most things eventually, including people, especially people." He looked at her for a moment. "What is it about people that bores you?" "They stop surprising you," she said. "Once you understand the system, the surprises stop. And I haven't stopped surprising you." "Not yet." He returned to his ledger. "I have a great deal of ongoing unpredictability in reserve," he said. "I wouldn't worry." She laughed and meant it, and the store was warm and Raymond Thomas was in the schoolroom, and Clara was on the floor near the stove with a picture book, and the afternoon was coming through the window at the angle that meant it was about 4 o'clock, and the day was rounding toward evening. And Maude Hadley Shelby sat behind the counter of the store, where she had begun to understand herself, and watched her husband's hand move across the ledger page with the practiced ease of 10 years of keeping careful accounts, and felt the specific quiet gladness that is the fullest kind, the kind that does not require anything from the future, because the present is already sufficient. In the spring of 1892, they made their third and final child, a boy they named William, who arrived in December with the red-faced outrage of someone who has been unexpectedly relocated and has opinions about it, and who moderated into a calm and cheerful baby within a few weeks, and who grew up to be the most sociable of the three Shelby children by a considerable margin, the one who knew everyone in town by name before he was 7, and who would eventually, many years later, take over the store from his parents with a combination of his mother's organizational precision and his father's fundamental decency. But that was later. In December of 1892, Abel and Maude Shelby had a new baby and a 9-year-old and a 3-year-old and a busy store and a growing town and a framed recipe on the kitchen wall. And on the evening of William's 10th day of life, when the older two were asleep, and the baby was fed and finally settled, and the house was quiet in the particular suspended way of houses with new babies in them, Maude stood in the kitchen in her dressing gown and looked at the framed recipe in the lamplight. Her mother's handwriting, the list of ingredients and the instructions and the 4 sentences below, words that had traveled in the back of an old book from St. Louis to Harlan Creek, that had fallen out of a book onto a store floor, that had started a conversation that had produced, through its continuation over nearly 10 years, a life that she would not have traded for any other life she could have imagined for herself. Abel came in from checking on the baby and found her standing there. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That my mother knew," she said. "She put that paper in that book and sent the book to Raymond's house, and she knew I would eventually come there and eventually find it. She did not know how or when, but she knew what she was beginning." He came to stand beside her and looked at the framed recipe the way he had been looking at it for 7 years, with the affectionate attention he gave to things that had earned it. "She began it," he said. "You and I continued it, and apparently intend to continue it for some time yet." "Indefinitely," he said. She leaned into him slightly, the comfortable lean of 7 years of marriage, and he put his arm around her in the natural, complete way of someone for whom this particular gesture has become as reflexive as breathing. "Do you think my mother would have liked you?" she asked. "I think she would have liked that you're happy." That is a very diplomatic non-answer. "All right," he said. "I think she would have found me somewhat reserved and then decided that the reservation was well-founded rather than cold, and she would have been satisfied." "That's very accurate, actually. I've given it some thought." Maude smiled. Outside, Harlan Creek was quiet in the December night, the cold clear and the stars extraordinary above the desert, as they always were in this part of the world, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the specific way of things that do not require human notice but are noticed anyway. She thought about her mother writing a recipe in her careful handwriting, and tucking a letter to her daughter's future into the back pages of a book with the faith, or perhaps the desperate hope of someone doing the best she could with what she had, and trusting that the rest would work itself out. She thought about an old book crossing the country in a crate, arriving in New Mexico territory, sitting in a dead man's house until it was carried to a store for sorting. She thought about the particular angle of a falling book, and the sound it made on a wooden floor, and a piece of paper catching the air and landing in a new life. She thought about Abel Shelby looking up from his ledger on an October afternoon and seeing her walk through his door. She thought about coffee, about the feel of a letter in her hand from a father she had thought was dead, about the creek in April and the new cottonwood leaves, and a kiss that tasted like the decision she had already made before she made it. She thought about a conversation that had started from a handwritten recipe and had not stopped and would not stop, a conversation that was the shape of her life now, the structure and the warmth of it, the ongoing negotiation between two people who had decided to keep talking until there was nothing left to say, which meant forever. "Abel," she said. "Maude," he said. It was not a question and it was not an answer and it was not the beginning of anything, because they had long since passed the beginning, and it was also not the end of anything, because they had no interest in the end. It was simply the two of them, in a kitchen in December, in a town in New Mexico territory, in the light of a lamp beside a framed recipe that had started all of this, saying each other's names because they could, because they would, because after everything and through everything and forward into everything, the simple fact of this particular person being in the same room remained the most extraordinary, ordinary thing either of them had ever known. William made a small sound from the next room, the specific sound of a baby registering a passing need without urgency. Abel kissed the top of her head. She started toward the baby's room. He followed. And outside, Harlan Creek breathed quietly in the winter night, and the stars turned their slow, enormous circles. And inside a warm house on the edge of a small town in the territory of New Mexico, a life that had started with a falling book and a piece of paper and 4 sentences written in a dead woman's handwriting continued forward into all the years it had waiting for it. All the ordinary beautiful days stacking themselves one upon the next, which was the only miracle that had ever mattered. The one that kept going, the one that never ended, the one that had begun with a recipe and would last, like the best conversations do, well past the point where anyone could see the finish.